Anyway, we're not here to talk about William Howard Taft. We're here
Right.
actually today to talk about the 1619 Project. I just kind of wanted to get a few thoughts on that story because it's so important and it's going on today. Um, so, for those of you who just tuned in, I'll just explain one more time that the 1619 Project is the New York Times. I I know the word revisionist history has like a moral tone to it. I'd like to use that word without that moral tone. I just want to say like revisionist, like a new way of framing history, let's say, based on an origin story that begins in 1619 when 20 African slaves were brought to the colony of Virginia. And it conveniently lined up with 2019, which was last year. So it would basically say that America's 400th anniversary was 2019, and that it was an anniversary of slavery.
Our decision to buy that first group of 20 to 30 Africans would influence almost everything that would follow after. I think it is foundational. It is as foundational to who we became as a country as our decision in 1776 to break off from the British.
And so with that frame, the 1619 Project seeks to explain all of American history as kind of originating from the existence of slavery, the pervasiveness of slavery, and the dependence on slavery that the United States had.
You can look at anything that's happening, just about anything that's happening in the world today, and tie it to slavery.
Absolutely. So there's a piece in there about why we're the only Western industrialized country that doesn't have universal health care. And it starts with opposition to universal health care that occurs right after slavery when the Freedmen's Bureau was trying to offer free health care to the formerly enslaved. And there was white opposition to that. The harms of slavery have not been contained because there are millions of white Americans, there are millions of Latinos and Asian and Black Americans who don't have health care, who can't get insurance because of slavery.
In contrast, President Trump has proposed the classic 1776.
I will soon sign an executive order establishing a national commission to promote patriotic education. It will be called the 1776 Commission.
1776. You know it. You love it. Your grandparents loved it. It's fine. You know, the good old 1776 that we've always known and loved, when Thomas Jefferson signed the Declaration of Independence, telling England to basically F off. So, I mean, that's something to be proud of. Yeah, remember when we told the British to F off? Let's make that our origin story. But that's 1776. And President Trump wants to kind of pursue an educational program that would use the classic 1776. And it's clearly in reaction to this 1619 Project.
Critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools, and it's being deployed to rip apart friends, neighbors, and families.
Which is actually being used for school curriculums as well. So children are being educated to understand 1619 in their classrooms. So this naturally has inflamed the classic, what are they teaching my children debate.
Moms and dads are going to demand that their children are no longer fed hateful lies about this country.
So to begin, I just wanted to maybe get some of your thoughts, Chris, on, let's start with just your general thoughts on this issue of 1619 verse 1776.
It's interesting that I think that there is a middle. I think that both projects trying to argue that America is one thing or another thing is actually a problem with history these days, in that I don't think that history is one thing or the other thing. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I think the 1619 Project has a lot of issues that academic historians, both Black and white, have pointed out. One of the leading essays basically says that the Revolutionary War was just about slavery, that the revolutionary cause was about protecting American slavery. That's not technically true. My friend Leslie Harris, who's a professor at Northwestern, who studies revolutionary history, colonial history, and slavery, she tried to correct the New York Times and tell them that, hey, that isn't right. There are a lot of people in the North who absolutely did not believe in slavery, did not fight the revolution for anything related to slavery. And a lot of Southerners, in fact, freed their slaves or promised freedom for their slaves if those slaves actually fought for the revolution. George Washington's army was the most integrated army up until really the 20th century. Until the 20th century. He relied heavily on people that he offered freedom to or that were given freedom, freed enslaved blacks or former enslaved blacks. But so I think that the story of America is just a lot more complicated than, oh, everything was about slavery. But I also think the whole 1776 thing with the whole patriotic education thing sounds way too much like North Korea for me. It sounds like, and quite frankly, you know what? If Donald Trump to teach the class, then I want him to teach me about 1776. Teach me about it. You know it. Yeah, tell me about it. Tell me what happened in 1776.
They seized the airports. They seized all the airports. You couldn't get out of Dulles. You couldn't get out of Reagan. You couldn't get out of LaGuardia. They seized the fleet. It was grounded.
Our army manned the airport. It ran the ramparts. It took over the airports. It did everything it had to do.
Yeah, exactly right. So a lot of the people who are, bitching about 1776 know nothing about 1776. They know nothing about the founding of the republic, right? Like if this project is to educate Donald Trump about the history of America, I'm all for it because he needs that education. Yeah. But if it's just about like winning points or basically like beating up on black people, which is like the thing of America in history, then it's kind of lame, I think. So I think that there is a needle to be thread that's in the middle between explaining and enriching the history and knowledge of America without necessarily demonizing the history of America. I don't think that at all. I mean, I think that there is a line to be drawn there, and I think that that's what we should be focusing on, and not on America all good or America all bad.
That's certainly what Sean Wilent's take was on 1776, and he was one of the historians who came out and criticized the 1619 project. Kind of similar to what you were saying, he argued that basically there's two ways to look at 1776. One way is to look at it as this glorious moment when like a great upswelling of justice propelled people to rise up against oppression and create a country based on freedom. The other way to view it is that there was a upheaval of all kinds that was taking place in the United States: social upheaval, economic, class war, people getting tarred and feathered, vigilante justice, race war, the dynamics of slavery, not necessarily just being like, we're just enslaving, but like, we'll free you, negotiating with slaves, like all this stuff going on in the United States, all this kind of unbalanced chaos that's going on around the revolution. That 1776 isn't a date that you should look back on and say, that's a date when we regressed. That it's a date when a lot of progress was born and a lot of possibility for progress was created. So that 1775 was not nearly as good of a year as 1776 was in terms of pushing people forward. And so to quote Sean Wilentz here in what he says about the 1619 project, he says, if the familiar view courts complacency, this one is vulnerable to an easy cynicism. So he says that it's a view that can lead to cynicism. Once slavery's enormity is understood as it should be, not as a temporary flaw, but as an essential fact of American history, it can make the birth of the American Republic and the subsequent rise of American democracy look as nothing more than the vindication of glittering generalities about freedom and equality founded on the oppression of blacks, enslaved and free, as well as the expropriation and slaughter of Native Americans. But it's like, it was. That's the problem with that statement. It actually was. Like, to be honest, it was. Now, there might be other good things that happened, but it was founded in those things. Like, it's wrong to say it wasn't. Right?
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But I do think that you have to think about this notion that what they founded wasn't perfect. It was far from perfect. It was very imperfect, especially for me as a black man. I will say that it was not perfect at all. But I
Right.
do think that the idea itself of America and the idea of equality, something that I don't think that they necessarily understood what they were giving birth to, actually has been a net positive for the world and for especially people here in the United States. I think that what they defined as freedom in 1776, yeah, that was totally messed up because it didn't include me, and it didn't include white men who didn't own property either. But as time went on, that definition gradually expanded beyond anything that they could have dreamed of. So, in that way, I think that not to like, I don't want to like fall into the Trump patriotic crap, but I do think that that's an important point that doesn't, and also the fact that so many African Americans did contribute to the revolution, did fight in the Revolutionary War, did fight to establish this country, and then built this country too,
Mhm.
along with Native Americans too. So I don't think that we should negate their contributions to building this country, and nor should we just say, I mean, and also, what is the end game of all of these classes and projects? Like, what's the end game of 1619? And what's the end game of 1776? What are we trying to do? I'm genuinely, I don't know. Like, what are we
Well,
trying to do?
in the case of 1776, we have a very well known and misrepresented date that everyone kind of agreed on, right? And
Yeah.
like it's pervasive, it's everywhere, and it obfuscates the
Hmm.
influence of slavery on how the United States became the way it is. It negates the experience of slavery and erases it to a degree. And in fact, to kind of like buttress that point, I wanted to show you this video to kind of try to
Hmm.
maybe express what I think the 1619 Project wants to correct. So we're going to see a video actually now. These are two of Thomas Jefferson's descendants.
Mm.
One of the descendants was a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Martha Jefferson. Was that her name?
Hmm. Yeah.
And the other is a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And the difference in how they understood their place in history does reveal a lot about this extreme like racial divide in how we talk about our history that I think the 1619 Project, however imperfectly, is trying to correct.
Slave owners all over the South had relationships with slaves. Why wouldn't Thomas Jefferson?
Lucian Truscott is Jefferson's sixth great grandson.
As a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, I was getting a run of the place. When I was a kid, I jumped on Thomas Jefferson's bed.
Shannon Lanier is also Jefferson's sixth great grandson, but he's from Sally Hemings' side.
My story is a little different from Lucian's because when we were studying the presidents in second grade, I stood up and I proudly said, Thomas Jefferson is my great, 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 great grandfather. And the teacher said, sit down and stop telling lies.
It's fascinating because it speaks volumes to who we are as a country. And even, it's interesting if you travel to Africa, or even like when you look at Black Americans here in America, they look very different than the people in Africa. I think that what is an American is so intertwined in what is a Black person in America. And I think this guy is a perfect example where, his ancestor was Thomas Jefferson. Kamala Harris's ancestor was a slaveholder. I think Barack Obama's ancestor as well, on his white side, was a slaveholder too. And so it's just interesting that just speaks to who we are as a country, that we have all of this intermingling or miscegenation. Ooh, as those people used to say, all that miscegenation, mixing of the races from the past. But I think it speaks to the kind of that needle I was talking about that needs to be thread about the story of America. And yeah, Thomas Jefferson is a perfect contradiction of what is an American, someone who talks about freedom and the need for free farms, who is loaded with debt and owned a bunch of slaves. So, yeah, I think that clip shows a lot about the country. What do you think?
What's interesting about the 1619 Project is criticized for being anti-patriotic, but actually the author of it prefaces the project based on the fact that her father was a veteran who was underserved, and he still flew the American flag every day in front of his house, and proudly flew it. And she never understood why, because being black in America, you get a raw deal. And then she like hated America, and then she kind of like came around through the 1619 Project to like understand better her country and feel more proud to be American.
But I
So
also think that, you know, one thing I would throw in is I think that there's so much idea of who owns this country, like who owns patriotism. And I think, you know, one thing that I always bring up is the fact that immediately after the American Civil War, in the South and among people who today could profess to be the most patriotic people, they actually didn't fly the American flag. There was Black Americans in Charleston, in Savannah. They're the ones that actually flew the American flag, celebrated the 4th of July, revered the founders of the country at a time when the South gave up on the United States. Southern whites gave up on the United States. In Charleston, it's a perfect example where on the 4th of July, really for the first 20 years after the Civil War, it was Black people who flew the American flag, and Southern whites would go in their house and close their windows and shutter their blinds in the dark on the 4th of July. And so Black people have always had a history of celebrating this country that has so been painful to them and been so hurtful to them, in large part because a lot of what is America has been built by Black America. A lot of promoting this country and moving this country forward has always been by Black Americans. I think if you talk to Black Americans, they view their role as the moral conscience and the moral fiber of this country. They always feel themselves to be that of the country. And so for us, I think that we don't look at it. I mean, I can't speak for all Black people. I can speak for myself, but I think as a Black man that I want to know all the bad things my country has done, not because like I want to know the good things and the bad things, because those are the things. It's important to know the things that happened. I don't think knowing one side of the story helps you, because it negates your ability to effectuate change for future generations and future things going on. Look, if you think that everything America does is great, then when America does something that's not so great, it'll surprise you. Similarly, if you think everything America does is bad, then when something good does happen, it'll surprise you too. And you shouldn't be surprised by both the goodness and the badness of the country. It's a country, and it's you and me. And I think that our responsibility is to look at both sides of those coins, so that we have a better understanding of how we got here.
Right. And so there's another issue with the 1619 Project that kind of came up in my research of it. And that is there's some doubt as to whether, or as I've heard from a few sources, but I haven't checked, there's some doubt as to whether the Africans that were brought over to the United States in 1619 were actually enslaved or were indentured servants.
The first sentence in the first essay is a lie. In 1619, 20 African slaves showed up in North America. The fact is, they weren't slaves. So it's time to drop the curtain, pack up the props, and go home.
What were they?
They were sold as indentured servants, and they served a time of indenture, and then they were free.
Do you know about anything about that?
Yeah, I know that there's some debate over it, but my assumption was they were. I mean, the thing is that the definitions of slavery, and this is something Leslie Harris pointed out, the definition of what was a slave and what you could do with slavery between 1619 and the colonial era versus the antebellum era were actually very different. People had a whole different sets of rights and a whole different set of potentials during the colonial era and before that they didn't necessarily have afterward. And so I think that that's where this debate comes in at is, I think that when they brought them over here, did they think of them as being, okay, you're going to be enslaved forever, and your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents? And that's not necessarily the case. It's very possible that many of them, when they came over, there was an understanding that they would work and could eventually somehow get their freedom. And so, yeah, I know that there is some debate, but I think the larger question is, and that's the bigger problem with the project itself, the 1619 project, is that it conflates slavery of the antebellum era with all slavery over the hundreds of years that there was slavery on the American continent. And I think that that's one of those things where we have to have the nuance to break up what is the distinctions in slavery in the different eras of the United States.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that when we're talking, in a lot of cases, when we talk about the deepest sort of stains of like racism in the American system, in terms of like what our laws, the ways our laws are actually racist, a lot of it stems out of this period when slavery almost became like abortion in a way, like one of those issues that like suddenly fired up the political consciousness of all these people, whether they were abolitionists, which I'm going to leave those aside for a second because I want to talk specifically about the Southerners who became radically pro-slavery suddenly and like propagandized for slavery and talked about slavery expansion, and they were like the radicals of slavery, like this, and then the race theory and all of the like scholarship and print and books that were written at that time to explain why Black people were inferior. Like that period in particular, that period could be an origin story, for being Black in America, don't you think?
For sure. For sure. I absolutely agree with you on that. That's very, very true. It could be an origin story in and of itself.
Right. But she actually, Nikole Hannah Jones actually starts the origin story in an interesting way in the slave ship. So her beginning is the Atlantic slave trade and the experience of being brought in the ship. And it's almost like it has this kind of birth sort of like rebirth element to it, because it's just sort of like, I mean, it's naked bodies in the bow of a ship, like crossing an fathomless ocean, and just to where they have no idea, they're in chains, like, and that's like the like origin story of like Black people being on the continent. Do you think that that's an accurate way? Do you think that that's it's very compelling, but is it helpful and is it accurate?
Why don't you think that it's why don't you think it's accurate or not accurate?
I think it represents so many people's experience, right? Like a lot of people did come to this country that way. But I don't know. I just wonder, like, it's a distant memory for the history of Black people. Like, it's generations removed from like you, for example, right?
Right. Yeah, that's true.
So like I have no sense of myself that long ago, because my ancestors moved to the United States at the turn of the century, and that's as far back as my family history goes, as far as what I know about my family history. I couldn't imagine something of the distant past of my Italian ancestors having some influence on me and the society today.
But I think that what they're trying to do is not necessarily connect me or other Black people of today necessarily to the past. I think they're trying to connect the whole idea of America as a project and a people to its past. I think it's trying to make a statement. It's funny that I think it's making a preemptive statement against 1776, in that they believe that America was not founded as a whole, not just me as a Black person, but America as a whole was not founded in 1776, but it was founded in 1619. And it was founded in this ship, basically, and that what happened with this ship and these people being brought over, that's the central focal point of the United States and its founding. And race is very much at the center of what is America. That's what they say. I don't necessarily know that that is true. I don't know if I would have begun with 1619. Maybe I would have begun with 1776, but with an understanding that all these things that happened in the past, and that slavery, while not the central issue, certainly was an issue that almost destroyed America at its founding. So, but I do understand why they would begin with 1619. I think it's a statement of this is where America began, and And that has less to do with just me as a Black person, but more to do with all of us as Americans.
Yeah. I mean, even if you take my ancestors, right? Italians, they came to the United States in like the 19 teens. So during the World War I period, Woodrow Wilson, right? And so they're immigrants coming into the northeastern part of the United States at a time when race riots are about to break out. And there's a huge amount of tension between immigrants and African Americans. And so like, and that, you know, so much of that tension derives from the time of the Civil War and because of slavery. And so like, you know, my ancestors bumped into, like, they came here to America and they encountered that, you know, immediately.
So 1619 doesn't resonate with you and your origin story as Johnny. But does 1776 resonate with you as well? Or is it the same kind of like maybe America begins for you in 1900, you know, like, or why don't you feel like, why do you, I think that that's the point of 1619, is to make you feel as connected to this origin story of race being the central focal point of America as you are to 1776 as American patriotism being the focal point of America. I think that that's sort of the point, is that I think for a lot of Americans, Black, white, or whatever, they don't feel any connection to 1619, but they damn sure feel connection to 1776, even though, you know, like, well, your ancestors didn't come until much later than 1776 or 1619. So why do you feel like any kind of connection to that year, not the other year?
Right, but at the same time, like if I saw a group of like like if a newly arrived family from El Salvador came to Washington D.C. and they like were like wanted to come to a 4th of July barbecue, of course I'd be like and wave the flag. I'd be like, you're an American, like you can raise the flag, you know. You don't have to be here. You don't have to have lived here since the beginning. You could have just, you know, you could have just arrived yesterday, and that's sort of, you know, the way that the United States. That's another. The immigrant story is also so central to the United States. You can't tell the story, and slavery is an immigration story. It's a forced immigration story.
Yeah,
like, and that, and the immigration from Europe and from China, and it's that in itself. Like you could maybe, I don't know what date you would pick. I guess 1492 then, because like that's when the dam burst essentially, or maybe some period like more like in the 1600s. Well, Plymouth Rock, right? That's another origin. The Pilgrims coming, they kind of opened the door to like massive immigration to the continent. So that could be an origin.
But I do think though that race relations and race may not be the central, but it's damn near close to the central issue of our country's history. And I think that that is the point of the 1619 project, is to make people understand not just the year 1619, but all the milestones in US history where very much race became the focal point. Look, when the Congressional Congress was meeting and debating, like the most contentious issues were not over what happened in 1492 or what happened in 1776 even. The most contentious issues were over Black people in slavery, right? When you think about why our country separated into a civil war, it was not over Plymouth Rock. It was over Black people in slavery. When you think about voting patterns, when you think about the things that have driven our country, when you think about how our country built its wealth, it's over that shit in 1619, probably even just as much as that shit in 1776. And so I think that that's the point of the project, as imperfect as it is, is that I think for a lot of people, they think the immigrant story is America's story, or the story of 1776 is our story. All those things are our story, and that's true. But the issues of race and the issues of how we define Black people and the role of Black people in our country has been central, or damn near central, to driving the decisions that we have made as a country. And you can't, I mean, if we had a civil war over other things, then maybe I would agree with you. Like, we didn't have a civil war over immigrants, right? We have not had a civil war yet over immigrants. We have not had a civil war over 1776. But we damn sure have had one over Black people and over race relations and over the role of Black people in our country. And so I think that when we think about what is central to the story of America, we look at where our money has gone and where what we have fought has gone to. And you find that for some reason, our treatment and desire to oppress Black people or see Black people freed has largely been present there. Even the populist movement in the 1890s, very much rooted in Black people as well. So I think that that's sort of, and I'm not defending the 1619 Project, but I do see what their point is about the United States.
Just want to acknowledge something that Peasant Like you said. I agree that anyone who shows up in the U.S. can be just as much of an American as someone whose family has been here for generations. But shouldn't all Americans get to know how their country started? Do new Americans have the same duty as generational Americans to learn about where the country comes from and the country's relationship with race? That's a great thing to think about because we have this sort of stereotype of like the immigrant who is like super patriotic. And so when we encounter Ilhan Omar, it's like she's so ungrateful. Everything she says, she's so ungrateful to be Americans because like so many immigrants are so pro-American and Ilhan Omar isn't. And so it can feed into the stereotype that like immigrants should be patriotic. I agree with that.
But I think that this is the false choice, right? Like you can love America and be patriotic and also recognize that America's